I'm Bob Short, and this is Reflections on Georgia Politics, sponsored by the Richard Russell Library at the University of Georgia and Young Harris College. Our guest today is Ron Fennel, former member of the Georgia House of Representatives and of the legendary Four Horsemen, and an aide to Governor Senator Zell Miller. Welcome.
Thank you, Bob.
Odom, Georgia.
It's a small town. When we grew up there, those of us in the farming communities who understood what it meant to go to town, that meant to go to Odom. And when you went to the city, it was to Jessup. And when you went to the big city, it was to Brunswick. So small town America is a part of an awful lot of folks' lives who get involved in something bigger than themselves, like public service. And I think it's an inspiration when you grow up out in the country and your family has all been farmers from the time you came over, and you see things that need to be done. And if you ever get an opportunity and you're given an education, you want to go out and do something with it. And that humble origin remains a part of who I am.
And then I believe you went to college at Georgia Southern.
I did. After St. Simon's Elementary, after I left Odom, went over to Glenn County where my dad was a home builder. He and his brother built homes on St. Simon's and Sea Island for 40 years. And I had the opportunity to go to Glenn Academy and then on to Georgia Southern. I was going to be a doctor. My mission, I went there on a chemistry scholarship. I'm going to study to be a doctor. I got derailed along the way because I found that I enjoyed getting involved in different organizations on campus, and I grew one into the other. And of course I ran for student government president. The whole chemistry department was totally alien with the concept of somebody wanting to do this. I had the head of the department build a helium balloon in the basement of the chemistry building and fill it with helium with my name on it. It was very bizarre. But we had a great time, and I enjoyed public service to that point. And while I was running for student government president, something happened that changed the course and direction of my life. And it was as I was writing articles in the local newspaper, the school newspaper, I read one issue where this fellow was coming to campus. I didn't know who he was. He had a funny sounding name, and apparently he was running for re-election and he was going to give a talk. Well, one of my platforms as a candidate for president of the student government was to get university status for Georgia Southern College at that time. And I said, well, I don't know who this fellow is, but he sounds important. I'm going to go over there and see if he could help us out. So I sat through an hour-long speech, and afterwards there was a reception, and he and his young aide walked into the room, and I dove into him. And he was at this reception for about an hour, and after 20 minutes, Zell Miller looked at me and said, I want to help you, but if you'll talk to my aide and let him get your information, there's some other folks who'd like to talk to me. Do you mind? So it was that moment that I met Zell Miller, and I didn't know it at the time, but he changed the direction of how my life would go, and I'm grateful.
Is that when you first got interested in politics?
Well, I was interested in it, but I didn't know there was an avenue to do something about it until I met him, and then a few months later got an opportunity when I got a phone call from his office. Mm-hmm. And that phone call was from Rick Hutto, the aide in question. Mm-hmm. And Rick, who is now a member of the Macon City Council, who married a young lady from Princeton whose roommate in college at Princeton went on to marry a fellow in the Middle East, and she's now known as Queen Noor of Jordan. So anyway, but Rick Hutto was the aide to Zell Miller that traveled with him on that trip, and he informed me by phone, I'm leaving to go to work in the Carter White House, and Miller has asked me to find somebody to replace me in this job. And he said, how about calling that fellow down there that at Georgia Southern that was annoying us so much? Something to that effect.
So you were with Miller for, what, 4 years?
4 years, pretty much on a consecutive basis. He gave me every odd job that you could hope for as a young, interested political person, intern, doorkeeper, general, go fetch this and aid, And then as it grew, being able to provide a little bit more feedback and a little more input for him.
That's what I learned a long time ago, was a hat and coat man.
That's right. How about a cup of coffee? I've lost my pen. I don't know how a man can stand in one place presiding over the Senate and lose 10 felt tip pens in one day, but I've seen it done. And it's a miracle of magic that I don't yet quite understand, but I was there ready with another pen.
How was it working for Miller?
It was terrific as a learning experience. It was challenging because as the Marine Corps drill sergeant, in him always demanded the best, expected the best. He was a workaholic himself, and if you didn't try to emulate that, you weren't keeping up. And it made all of us around him better, and we tried to learn every day from him, and just nuances. We could learn just by watching a few little items, and we all tried to do that and tried to make it better in his office, and it was a lot of fun.
You were there during his 1980 campaign for the United States Senate. What do you remember about that?
Well, I remember driving him an awful lot across different parts of the state and flying in little puddle jumper airplanes, both in that campaign and then later on in the '84 campaign where we were trying to help Walter Mondale. But I remember dropping him off one night somewhere in the middle of godforsaken nowhere, and it was about 10:20. We had a long, hard day, worked an awful lot, and he said, "We don't have to get an early start tomorrow. You can pick me up around 5:30. And I got there at 5:20, and he was already waiting on me. So it gave you the understanding and appreciation for the man and his drive and his energy. And it took a lot for all of us to keep up with it.
Many people were, I guess, disappointed is the word when Miller failed to win the Democratic nomination. Is that not true?
It is. I remember I was in the office on his birthday in 1980. When he came out, we were trying to celebrate his birthday, and he didn't like that celebration, the birthday cake and all that nonsense. He's more interested in talking about and thinking about the campaign. And he came out of his pocket with a handmade brochure. And the phrase, "Best Senator Money Can't Buy," was seen for the first time among the staff. And I remember thinking, that's not going to work. But I, the most junior member, wasn't going to say anything. I got the point, and I understood what his reference was to Senator Talmadge, but he had so much in the way of positive attributes and offerings that the people of Georgia would have readily responded to, rather than that tact of trying to point out that Senator Talmadge was challenged. And I think that was my biggest disappointment of that year, apart from the fact that he lost the nomination. Ironically, the guy whose office I later rented to run my state legislative race was Mac Mattingly. So, and I grew up around him while I was at school. I would go to Georgia Southern. His daughter and I went to school together, so I would frequently stop by and pick her up. And so I'd have to chat with Mac Mattingly. And a couple years later, here he was elected to the United States Senate, and I was baffled that Georgians could opt, for inexperience and a disconnect in a lot of people's minds, as opposed to a more informed and energetic choice. But it was an interesting campaign of 1980.
Well, from Miller, I believe you held several positions in the state party.
I did.
Democratic.
Let me go to one point. I want to get this on the record, because the first time I ever heard the name Bob Short, I thought it was an invention, that this wasn't a real person. And I'll tell you why. Whenever I went to work for Zell Miller in '79, I would occasionally be tasked at lunchtime, when the girls would go to lunch, just answering the phone. And I would get an operator call, collect call for Bob Short. Well, the first couple of times I had no clue what to do with it. And finally, Marty Pingree came out and said, "Oh, that's Miller calling from the road. Just refuse the charges and get the number and we'll call him back." So we used the Watts line. I think the statute of limitations has run out, so AT&T's not going to chase us down Bell South at the time. But this was a way to save money, using the Watts line to call out, but not being able to call in from a payphone, and they still had plenty of payphones back in the day. But Miller would travel everywhere and call into the office to get messages and check in, and he would call in, collect call for Bob Short. I don't know if you knew that, but that's how, for years, I didn't know you actually existed until I finally met you. So I wanted to make sure that was on the record, because it was an entertaining and an educational thing, because he was saving money for the taxpayers by calling back on the wide area telephone system network at reduced rates, as opposed to calling collect and having to pay for the fees.
Well, thanks. I never knew that. I never knew that. But from Miller's office as Lieutenant Governor, you held several positions in the state Democratic Party.
I did.
Tell us about that.
Well, it was a lot of fun. Miller introduced me to an awful lot of the people, and having been a party operative himself, he understood that is a great proving ground for an awful lot of people, and he gave me an opportunity by introducing me to these people. I became a part of the staff. I worked for Tommy Coleman. When he was executive director, I was the first executive director of the Young Democrats of Georgia, the first one. It was a position a lot of young folks felt like was needed. We were a very active chapter of the Young Democrats, and so I did an awful lot of things there. Grew that into a number of areas of service, and then became field director of the party in '84 at Miller's request. He was lieutenant governor, but he was actually helping a candidate running for president, and he needed somebody over there. And he said, I need somebody over there who'll run it the way I would. I can't be there. The legislature's going to have me tied up. I want you to go over there and do that. And so on his behalf, I did that and worked the field operation for the state. Ironically, we were basing our office in Atlanta, but Andrew Young was the mayor of Atlanta. We kept getting into priority differences. He thought all the resources ought to be spent on getting out the vote in Atlanta, which was, a laudable goal, but I had more of a mission than that, to help win more of the state. And so after a couple of fights, as it were, internally and behind the scenes, I went to him and I crafted a 3-page memo to ZM from RF, and he had Martha retype it, and it said memo to RF from ZM, and it was everything that I had written, which was flattering, but it was a mission statement and it was a plan of action, and we took it and ran with it. And I moved my offices to Macon, where George Israel was the mayor. We ran our campaign there. They even brought Ronald Reagan to town to Macon. We won Bibb County at the end of the day. So I'm proud of the operation we had. Obviously, we didn't win the state or the national election, but we did what we could. And I remember Andrew Young had an opportunity to be confronted about those of us in the campaign, and he called us SAWBs. If you remember this term, I'll pardon but the historical record should reflect. Called us smart-ass white boys, because we felt like we knew what we needed to do. And very soon thereafter, Burt Lance and a couple of the others stepped in, mollified the situation. We had a reception with Mondale out at Ann Cox Chambers' house, and there at that evening, all of us gathered around. Andy Young came out of his briefcase and handed each of us who were on the team an SAWB button. And he said, you white boys are smarter than I thought you were. So it was one of those moments where you appreciated being involved in the battles, but being on the same team. And so that operation as a field director gave me an awful lot of experience and a lot of enjoyment. And later on, Miller asked me, when he became governor, to be executive director of the party. And that was a great privilege and an honor to do that. I did that for almost a year. It was mostly a fundraising position at that point, part of the business I hated, still do to this day, but as a necessary part. We raised about $1 million in less than a year, and at that time that was a record. There were a lot of good people who were doing the fundraising, but it wasn't a role that I preferred. I preferred the more nuts and bolts, more field operation, more grassroots. And so I did my 15 years of service to the Democratic Party, from being a member of the local committee, my local county chair, my Senate district chair, field director, Young Democrats president, and on an executive director. So after 15 years, I felt like that was an ample service to my party, and I'm proud of it, but that was enough.
Well, Ron, while we're on the subject of parties, let's talk a little bit about Georgia becoming a two-party state after, 137 years
Right.
of Democratic rule. How do you define that growth?
Georgia has always been a conservative-leaning state, always. Probably always will be. Atlanta, urban areas have more folks who vote Democratic on a consistent basis, but Georgia as a whole is a conservative state. We voted nationally most every time for the more conservative candidate unless we had a reason. If Lyndon Johnson stands up with the governor and puts his hand around John Kennedy and said, this guy will be all right for us, then we have a tendency to support that candidate. Or a native son like Jimmy Carter, or almost native son like Bill Clinton. But otherwise, we've pretty well selected on a national basis the more conservative candidate on the national ticket. So it's not surprising that we've had that bent, but it is surprising in some of the elections because we've had some political lions that have been Democrats in Georgia that have endured over a long span, from Carl Vinson to Richard Russell to Tom Murphy to the Zell Millers, that had a long reign as a Democrat incumbent who happened to have a conservative philosophy of government, balancing the budget, encouraging a strong defense, supporting the Second Amendment, a lot of things that people consider to be on a national basis now just automatic Republican-based issue-oriented philosophies. It's always been the part of Georgia's mindset and behavior.
Some disenchanted Democrats believe that their party is too liberal, too urban, too dependent on minority and labor votes. Is that fair to say?
There's a lot of truth in elements of that. For rural Georgians, unions have never been a part of their experience. For rural Georgians, urban crises and challenges and issues have never been really a part of their makeup. So they don't identify well with those. So when the issues that are forwarded by, in this case, the modern Democratic Party on the national basis, they focus on those types of issues. And, the little guy living out in, Hayhira or Odom doesn't quite connect with those issues. You're not talking about my issues. And so it makes it easy for them to seek an alternative. And the alternative has always been, well, this party seems to be a lot more identifying with my conservative values. Mm-hmm. So I think that has changed the way party perception among Georgians has allowed for a turn. And I watched it up close. I had already left the legislature. I remember I left as executive director of the party at the end of 1991. Handed the keys over to Scotty Greenwood, and she was the last executive director to preside over a majority in the congressional delegation. In 92, we elected Republicans, and we had one Republican in the congressional delegation when I was executive director, a fellow by the name of Newt Gingrich. I don't know whatever happened to him. But it was 80% Democrat legislature, House and Senate. You had every constitutional officer filled with a Democrat, no prospect for a Republican even to get more than 40%. It was a different day as recently as 92 in that regard, and then 94 happened in the Newt Gingrich revolution in Washington, and all those things that occurred thereafter.
How difficult will it be for the Democrats to regain a majority in the state legislature?
I think we're down to 68 as of this week, Democrats in the House. That is a daunting challenge. I remember when I came into the legislature, the Republicans had 62 or 63 seats. They felt totally disenfranchised, were never heard, and God love him, Tom Murphy made sure of that in the House. We had a different dynamic working, even though most of us who were moderates, however you term that, Many of the young faces that came in were a little more progressive, but we weren't considered liberal, a couple maybe, but mostly we were moderates, and we were just looking to operate in this environment which was trending more conservative. And then the Lions had been there, like Tom Murphy was a conservative, bona fide, had all the credentials in the papers, but still remained a Democrat. So it was an interesting dichotomy to live through.
What do you think of the great number of Democrats who have switched parties in order to hold on to their seats?
That's if you will resign your seat. I'll tell you the one example that impressed me the most, and that was in Texas. A Georgia boy by the name of Phil Graham, University of Georgia product. He resigned his seat in Congress because he said the party had left him. They held a special election. He ran as a Republican and got himself elected. That's the way to do it. If you're honest with the voters, I am no longer a member of this party. I can no longer serve, therefore, as the party's nominee and elected representative. I'm okay with that. But when you switch after you've been elected, I've got a little bit more of a challenge and a problem with that.
Let me ask you this question.
Sure.
If you were in office today, would you still be a Democrat?
It'd be more difficult for me. Where I represented Glenn County in the legislature, Brunswick, part of coastal Georgia, St. Simons and Jekyll in that area. It would be very challenging, even though my district, as it was carved at the time, was pretty much a 50-50 district. And remember, I was elected to the legislature having defeated an incumbent Republican, the only one that year to be defeated in the entire legislature, House or Senate. So I was one of those unique guys. I remember Buddy Darden had a similar distinction in 1980 when he was elected in that race. He was the only one. As the trend went and waved Republican, he got elected in that unique situation too. But for now, where I live in Cobb County, I live in Smyrna, so I'm in South Cobb. But I mean, I could probably still get elected as a Democrat in some parts of the county. Much like that dividing line that Buddy used to talk about between the East and the West, but it would be a little bit more challenging. My views are still pretty much where they were all along. Most of us have strong conservative views on a number of issues, and we're pretty socially compassionate. And I consider Tom Murphy the first compassionate conservative I ever met. I heard it later on used to identify the Bush family or Ronald Reagan. Tom Murphy was the original conservative who was compassionate that I saw with my own eyes.
So you're elected in 1988.
Correct.
And you defeated. Tell us about that campaign.
Well, growing up, you think about things that you want to do in life, and this never was on my radar screen till I met Miller. And after I saw how it operated and how an opportunity to serve existed, I started studying it. And I ran for the legislature in '86, and I lost by four votes in the Democratic primary to a local political legend who went on to serve two terms on the county commission and 3 terms in the state house. But after I was out, that's another story, and we'll get into it in a little bit. But I lost by 4 votes. After having campaigned for well over a year, I'd worked my construction job. I worked in the family construction business. We built houses, so 7 o'clock in the morning I had to make sure we had materials on the job site and that the right guys showed up and knew where to go and what to do. And I had to stay and make sure everything was buttoned up at the end of the day. So 4 o'clock, I'm taking a shower, putting on my white shirt, my tie, and I'm knocking on doors with brochures until dark. Did that an awful lot, like a lot of candidates. And after having done that part-time for a year, and to lose by 4 votes was quite traumatic. And you know, back then as today, candidates stand near the polling places and they wave at voters by holding a sign and give that last visual image before a voter goes in. I watched a later model car, a large car, 5 guys drove up, had my opponent's bumper sticker on there, and they drove up and they were laughing and waving, hey! And they drove up, parked, and went in the polling place at 5 minutes till 7 p.m. Those 5 gentlemen cast ballots that I watched, which defeated me. It was very seared on my brain at that point. But I lost to an interesting fellow, Reverend E.C. Tillman. Shiloh Baptist Church, the largest African American congregation between Savannah and probably Orlando. And he marched with Dr. King in Daytona Beach. He was a bona fide legend, had been school board member, etc. And he had been the nominee twice before, and this was his third time getting the nomination, and lost to two different Republicans. So it was obvious that the voters in that district, while they may have been able to elect a Democrat, just chose that it was not his time and that he was not the right person. But that didn't help me any, having lost by 4 votes. So I had to spend the next 2 years working at it to go again. Well, the month after the election was over and Reverend Tillman lost, we had our local Democratic Party meeting, and I had been active there for a few years. And I went to that meeting, and I stood up whenever the chairman said, "Anybody have anything you want to offer as regards the election?" And I stood up and I congratulated the Reverend on running a great race, and I appreciated it. But I am now a candidate for the next time around. We've given the Reverend 3 times, and I'd like to just put everyone on notice that I'm running right now for the next time around, and I'd appreciate everybody's support. And so I put that out. And then when you're in your 20s and you do that, and all the old guard is sitting there, it makes them sit up and take notice. And you know, those of us who are young and brash and really wanted to serve, I didn't run against him, I just ran for the job. And I wanted to make sure that I had my head start that I had missed out on the time before. As it happened the following year, he and I worked out an arrangement. I lost in the absentee box. I was up by 53 votes until they opened the absentees. I didn't have an absentee precinct coordinator or manager or whatever, but I found out who his was. And the day after I found out who it was, I went and knocked on her door, and I sat on her porch for 3 hours, and we became fast friends. And the next time around, she was my absentee ballot coordinator, and we won. It was a great privilege to run a campaign where I just talked about what I wanted to do, why I wanted the job, and I just acted like that was an open seat. I never mentioned my opponent, never responded to anything. My opponent ran like a challenger, attacking me, attacking my lack of a record, and saying bad things about me. I just ignored it and ran a campaign for the job. And the voters of my district saw fit to hire me. And so it was a great moment. And like I say, I ran my campaign out of Mac Mattingly's old typewriter shop there in town. It had a historical significance that I couldn't overlook as an ironic twist. So,
So January 1989, you went to the Capitol.
You know, when you walk in that building, I don't care who you are, if you have any sense of history and an appreciation for the value that your government has, you get chills walking in the building. And I did that day. I was trembling when I put my hand on the Bible and raised my hand, and Tom Murphy said, "Repeat after me," and we all had the oath and were sworn in. And he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, you've hereby been sworn in. Be prepared hereafter to be sworn at." And it set the tone for those of us. And I looked around in this august body, and I saw this ornate structure and this history, and I said, man, how did I get here? And after the second or third day, I looked over and I said, how did he get here? And then how the heck did he get here? And I guess that's what happens when good people don't vote. At least that was my conclusion.
Well, who were some of your friends?
Well, it was a great treat to come in with an awful lot of folks, Democrats and Republicans, that are friends to this day. There was a small group of us. We had 23 Democrats in our crowd, and I think there were 12 or 13 Republicans. Earl Earhart was in that group. We had, in the Democratic contingent, we had quite an interesting bunch. Cynthia McKinney to Judy Pogue, the former sheriff of Murray County. Yes, his nickname was Judy. Don't ask me to explain that. we had Karen Irwin, who served just a term. We had a couple of people that spent some time. A guy named Thurbert Baker, I'm not sure really what happened to him, but his going on to become Attorney General was a proud moment for a lot of us to know that he had the confidence of the governor. But there was this group that kind of whittled itself down and became fast friends. 4 young, 30-year-old, aggressive, semi-polished, aggressive, active young guys. We're all single, and we had a blast. It was
4 horsemen.
The newspaper dubbed us the 4 Horsemen. I'm not sure where that term came from for the reporter. We were termed a lot of different things, but it was Doug Teeper, whom I had met many years before when I was on the campus at Georgia Southern. I was writing an article for the local newspaper, for the school newspaper, the Georgian. And I was writing a story about this organization trying to be created on campus, GAIN, Georgians Against Nuclear Energy. Well, at the time I was in the chemistry program and I was studying nuclear chemistry, and I was actually pro-nuclear. I thought it was a great alternative energy source. But I was a reporter on this story, and 14 people showed up to organize this chapter, and they needed 15. I didn't have a story, so I joined the chapter as a pro-nuke in order to get the story, and Doug Teeper was the organizer of that meeting. So I met these young, he had a giant afro, he was a wild child, and I learned an awful lot about his history over time at the University of Georgia, and his running for student government president, the unknown candidate, the race for Congress, all the rest. But there are 10,000 Doug Teeper stories, and you ought to get those straight from the horse's mouth. But Ray Holland, very bright lawyer, extremely focused, and a guy who had perfection written all over him. And in Southwest Georgia, I didn't understand how perfection could get elected. Here's a guy who might have been in a pickup truck in his life. He used a picture of one on his campaign brochure, but he drove a red Corvette. His hair was always perfectly in place. His suits were Brooks Brothers and well-tailored. He was extremely detailed in everything, and a very bright lawyer. How does somebody like that get elected from farm country in Southwest Georgia? We didn't understand. But not only did he get elected, he beat every other challenger in an open primary. His first time out, he beat 5 opponents without a runoff. So it was here's a guy who everybody understands, he's the smartest kid in the room. Let's bring him and let him be our guy. And so he was the one, and then my buddy McCracken Poston, who has gone on to do some incredible things, but in that freshman class it was obvious he was the guy who had the angle on how to communicate the message best. He has a grasp of the issues readily. He's very smart, obviously, but he also went with 2 things in mind, I think. One, he wanted to do a great job for his area of the state and look after folks. And he later grew more and more attuned to the constituent service component. But in the beginning, we wanted to just get noticed, and we did. And Tom Murphy and the leadership embraced us, sort of cocooned. For whatever reason, the 4 of us sort of became the fair-haired children. I'm sure frustrated an awful lot of folks watching, particularly those who had been around a little bit longer, and the Larry Terry group. But it was fun in that first period of time to make sure we were on the team. They were making sure that we were catered to some degree. And it was fun. We all became happy and maybe a little too cocky, as young legislators do. But we had some interesting experiences. For the first 2 years I was in the legislature, the speaker invited a very select group to his birthday party. They would have just a private dinner and had a little country band, and the speaker would get up and sing Your Cheatin' Heart with the band and dance with his lady friend at the time. But it was a lot of fun. These 4 guys that became known as the 4 Horsemen, that we had tons of fun together and did a lot of interesting things and got involved in some interesting things